Says Bill planned on leaving the park before dark, and when she still hadn't heard from him by Friday morning, she called rangers, who launched a search effort that's grown.
An incredible story of survival. A hiker survived 5 days alone out in Joshua Tree.
It all started on the last week of December in 2012. My mother and I were relaxing after work, watching TV, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in our hallway. When I turned to look, I noticed two shadowy-like figures that appeared on our hallway wall. In disbelief of what I was seeing, I turned my head over towards my mother, and right as I did, she made eye contact with me and simply said, "You see them, don't you?" I said yes. She told me not to acknowledge them because they're entities that can sense fear. But in disbelief, I looked back over at the hallway wall, and they were gone. A few days had gone by, and my mother told me she felt a sense of dread and said someone in our family is going to pass away before the end of the year. Well, on New Year's Eve, 2012, my mother and I celebrated at home. We watched the movie Tron and had a pizza delivered to ring in the new year. I've always been a real mama's boy, so this was an ideal way for me to spend my New Year's Eve. Around 11 p.m. that night, we saw the two figures again. This time, we both experienced an overwhelming quietness and sense of urgency and dread. We both did our best to ignore it, and eventually the shadowy figures and the senses went away. We discussed the experience, and again my mother told me to never acknowledge them, and before I could press her for more details, my mother started telling me how much I meant to her and that I would go on to do great things in my life. She loved me, etc. She then got up and walked towards the kitchen, turned around and said, "I love you," then fell to the ground. I had previous EMT training and am certified in CPR, so I dialed 911 and explained to them my mother is in cardiac arrest and I needed medical assistance ASAP. I was doing CPR on my mother for nearly 20 minutes, and for anyone who's ever done CPR, it's not easy. The EMTs arrived at 11:38 p.m., and my mother was taken to the emergency room. By this time, our neighbor and friend Bonnie had rushed over to my house and drove me to the hospital. When I checked in at the front desk, I was taken to a small private room, and the head physician told me that my mother had passed away. The autopsy showed my mother suffered from a fatal heart attack, and her time of death was 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 2012. When I was taken in to see her one last time, her lips were blue, she was cool to the touch, but she was still my mom. So I just hugged her and couldn't let go for nearly 30 minutes. Thankfully, my neighbor Bonnie was there and gave me plenty of support and encouragement to leave, as my mother would want me to stay strong. Fast forward about 6 months after my mother died, I'd quit my job and had become a recluse. I would only leave my house to purchase groceries. I quickly realized how severely depressed I was and decided it was time to get away. I ended up traveling to Joshua Tree National Park and decided it would be my getaway to find some peace and closure. I notified my neighbor Bonnie not to worry, that I'm just going on a day's hike and would be back by midnight. When I arrived at Joshua Tree, I parked my Jeep and entered the Lost Palms Oasis Trail. After a few hours of walking and hiking, I stopped to take a break and eat. As I finished up and looked around, nothing looked familiar, and I in fact was not on any trail. I was not too worried and felt confident I would find my way back, but as I made my way through the desert landscape that I did not recall ever passing, I started feeling like I was being watched. I started to panic. Then I started hearing strange growling noises, but could not determine from what direction they were coming from. It almost seemed like they were all around me. So I stood in one spot and made a 360-degree rotation. As I came to a stop, I saw something transparent, no defining shape, just a blur directly in front of me that was coming closer and closer to where I was standing. I quickly turned around and started walking faster and faster in the opposite direction, and then experienced the same overwhelming quietness and sense of urgency and dread I had experienced with my mother just 6 months prior. Then all of a sudden, almost like a snap of a finger, daytime turned into night. I wasn't sure what was going on, but knew something wasn't right. After walking around in the dark, I found myself by a large rock, about as big as a large SUV, and felt safest there. I put my back against the rock. This way I felt nothing would sneak up behind me. I used the night to hydrate and eat some snacks I brought. I remember trying to make sense out of what I was experiencing, but knew that my mother and I had already experienced something within our own home. But at least when I was home, I felt safe. Here, I was vulnerable and alone. As I tried to rest that night, I started seeing a number of shadowy entities walking around in the desert, almost as if they were wandering around aimlessly. It freaked me out, and the more I acknowledged them, the closer they got to me. At one time during the night, I remember feeling something breathing down my neck. Remember, my back was against a huge rock. I just closed my eyes and did my best to keep them shut. The last thing I remember about that night was opening my eyes and seeing 3 shadowy figures, one at each side and one directly in front of me. Then once again, in a snap, it was morning. I would experience the same weirdness for 2 more days until the last day. On the last day of me roaming around Joshua Tree, I hadn't had any food or water since the initial first night. I was scared and dehydrated. I came upon another large rock and remembered in my EMT training that digging a hole near a rock in the desert will keep you cool and less likely to get severe sunburn. I did just that and thought to myself, I'm literally digging my own grave. By the time I laid down in the 2-foot arched hole I'd made and covered my chest and legs up with dirt, I blacked out. I don't remember anything for the rest of that day or night. The next morning, I was woken by an off-duty search and rescue employee who was literally making me choke on water. I remember him saying, "There are a whole lot of people out looking for you, buddy." I was picked up by helicopter and taken to Regional Medical Center in Palm Springs, California. In the days during my recovery, I saw 2 detectives, a number of psychiatrists, and my neighbor Bonnie, who was there at the hospital by my side 100% of the way. The detectives wanted to close the missing persons report my neighbor Bonnie made the second day I was missing, but they asked me strange questions like, was I using a flare gun in the area? No. And why had I purchased a large amount of camping gear and survival materials prior to my hike? I'm going for a hike. Strange questions to ask someone, or maybe it's just me. The physician stated he thought I was planning to kill myself due to the loss of my mother, but honestly, that never crossed my mind. The psychiatrist told me I didn't experience anything but hallucinations due to the lack of food and water and effects of dehydration. My neighbor Bonnie overheard my story and later confided in me that she too experienced similar shadowy figures when she hiked in Joshua Tree. When I arrived back home, she used sage and other New Age methods to rid my house of whatever darkness was there. However, it continued all the way up until my move to Tennessee in 2014. By far the most aggressive was the transparent entities that were in Joshua Tree. I felt like everything was about to end when I encountered them. I've always wondered if my mother experienced more than what happened that night. I'm not sure what the hell happened those few days in Joshua Tree National Park, but from what I can remember, during the moments when daytime would turn into night in a snap, I felt like I was falling down or being suspended in midair before completely realizing what was going on. I also remember a strong urge to go to Joshua Tree. I would think about going all the time, and when I finally went, I almost felt like I was being called there by something. My sister often talks about my first week living in Tennessee. She said that she felt like a demon was attached to me. One night as I slept on her couch, I woke up with her putting holy water on my head and saying a prayer over me. But I don't believe in all that. I used to. But nowadays, I have an easier time believing in alien abductions and portals rather than being followed around by a demon. But then again, who knows, right? Finally, I can tell you with 100% honesty, I experienced all the above. I can't explain what it or what they were, but I can tell you I feel like my life was spared for some strange reason. Perhaps I didn't meet the requirements for whatever it is they need. Looking back now, I would never have gone hiking alone. But again, I remember this irresistible urge to go to Joshua Tree, and would frequently feel like I was being called there.